The dust had settled thick on Martha Henderson's dreams by the time she turned 35, coating them like the red dirt that perpetually covered everything on their small homestead outside Willow Creek, Kansas. The year was 1873, and Martha had been married to Thomas Henderson for 12 long years, each passing season marking another failed hope for the patter of tiny feet across their weathered wooden floors. The prairie wind seemed to mock her with its howling through the gaps in their cabin walls, carrying the distant sounds of children playing in town, sounds that felt like daggers to her already wounded heart. Thomas was a good man, weathered by the harsh frontier life, but kind in his quiet way. His hands, permanently stained with soil and calloused from years of fighting the stubborn Kansas earth, would sometimes rest gently on Martha's shoulders when he found her staring out the window toward the horizon. He never spoke of his own disappointment, but Martha could see it in the way his eyes lingered on families in town, how his jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly when neighbors would announce another pregnancy. They had tried everything the frontier had to offer, from the traveling medicine man's dubious tonics to the old wives' remedies shared in hushed tones at the general store. Dr. Brennan, the only real physician within 50 miles, had examined Martha twice and delivered the same devastating verdict each time with clinical coldness that made her feel more like a broken piece of farm equipment than a woman yearning for motherhood. Their farm was modest by any standards, 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act, with a small cabin, a weathered barn that leaned slightly to the east, and enough land to grow wheat and corn to keep them fed and provide a small income. The livestock consisted of 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens that Martha tended with perhaps more affection than was practical, and an old workhorse named Samuel that Thomas had acquired in a trade 3 years prior. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse, giving them privacy to grieve their childlessness, but also magnifying the silence that filled their home where laughter and young voices should have echoed. Martha had developed a routine of walking to the barn each evening as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, a time when the day's work was done and the loneliness seemed most acute. She would check on the animals, gather eggs if the hens had been cooperative, and sometimes simply stand in the doorway, looking out at the endless grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. It was during one of these evening visits, on a particularly cold October night when the first frost had begun to silver the grass, that Martha heard something that made her heart nearly stop beating. The sound was faint at first, barely audible above the wind rattling the loose boards of the barn, but it was unmistakably human and heartbreakingly small. Martha froze, straining her ears and wondering if her desperate mind was playing cruel tricks on her. The sound came again, a weak cry that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the barn, beyond where the animals were kept. With trembling hands, Martha lit the oil lantern that hung by the door and began moving slowly through the barn, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard across the prairie. The cries grew slightly louder as she approached the far corner where they stored hay and old equipment, and there, nestled in a pile of horse blankets that had been arranged with obvious care, was the most beautiful sight Martha had ever beheld. A baby, appearing to be no more than a few weeks old, wrapped in a woman's shawl that had seen better days but was clean and warm. The infant's tiny fists waved in the air as it cried, and when Martha brought the lantern closer, she could see that it was a healthy-looking child with dark hair and skin flushed pink from crying and cold. Martha's hands shook as she carefully lifted the baby, and the crying immediately subsided, as if the child recognized that help had finally arrived. The baby was surprisingly warm despite the October chill, and Martha realized that whoever had left this precious bundle had done so recently and had taken care to ensure the child's comfort. Wrapped with the baby was a small piece of paper, worn and creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. In shaky handwriting, barely legible in the lamplight, were the words that would change Martha's life forever. The note was brief, but heartbreaking in its simplicity, written by someone who clearly had little formal education, but possessed a mother's desperate love. It read, "Please take care of my sweet girl. Her name is Hope. I cannot give her the life she deserves, but I pray someone can. She is good and sleeps through most nights. God bless whoever finds her." Martha felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she read those words, understanding immediately the terrible desperation that would drive a mother to make such an impossible choice. The prairie was unforgiving to women alone, and Martha knew there were circumstances that could leave a woman with no alternatives, no matter how much she loved her child. Hope, for Martha had decided immediately that the name would stay, seemed to sense that she was finally safe. The baby's cries had turned to small whimpering sounds, and then to a contentment that spoke of exhaustion and relief. Martha found herself making the same soft, cooing sounds she had observed other mothers making, sounds that seemed to come from some deep, instinctive place within her that she had never known existed. The baby's tiny hand wrapped around Martha's finger with a grip that felt like the strongest chain ever forged, binding them together in a way that Martha knew was permanent and unbreakable. Thomas nearly dropped his coffee cup when Martha walked through the cabin door, carrying the bundle, her face glowing with a happiness he had not seen since their wedding day. The explanation tumbled out of her in a rush of words and tears, and Thomas listened with growing amazement and concern. He was a practical man, and his first thoughts were of the legal implications, of the possibility that someone might come looking for the child, of the dangers of assuming responsibility for another person's baby without proper authority. But as Martha unwrapped Hope and revealed the tiny, perfect face, Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth spreading through him that he recognized as the feeling he had dreamed of experiencing when holding his own child. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and joy that the Henderson homestead had never experienced. Martha threw herself into caring for Hope with the dedication of a woman who had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even though she had never realized it. She fashioned diapers from old flour sacks, created a cradle from a wooden crate padded with her softest quilts, and somehow managed to convince their milk cow Bessie to provide the nourishment that Hope needed to thrive. Thomas found himself making frequent trips to town, purchasing supplies they would need and casually inquiring whether anyone had heard of a missing baby or a woman in distress who might have recently given birth. The people of Willow Creek were good folk for the most part, but frontier life had made them practical about matters of survival and somewhat suspicious of situations they could not fully understand. When Thomas mentioned finding a baby, the responses ranged from congratulations to barely concealed skepticism about the story's veracity. Sheriff Coleman, a man whose weathered face had seen enough frontier justice to make him cautious about unusual circumstances, paid a visit to the Henderson place 3 days after Hope's arrival. He examined the note, listened to Martha and Thomas tell their story with obvious emotion and sincerity, and ultimately concluded that without any reports of a missing child or claims from anyone seeking to recover a baby, the Hendersons were free to care for Hope until such time as other arrangements might become necessary. Dr. Brennan was summoned to examine Hope and pronounced her to be in excellent health despite her unusual circumstances. The doctor, who had delivered the devastating news about Martha's infertility, seemed genuinely pleased to see the joy that caring for Hope had brought to the couple. He provided instructions for the baby's care and feeding, and before leaving, he placed his hand on Martha's shoulder and told her that sometimes the Lord worked in mysterious ways to answer prayers, even when the answer came in a form that no one could have expected. As the weeks turned into months, Hope became the center of the Henderson household in every possible way. Martha discovered that she possessed maternal instincts that felt as natural as breathing, and she marveled at how completely this tiny person had filled the emptiness that had defined her adult life. Thomas proved to be an equally devoted father figure, crafting toys from wood scraps during the long winter evenings and singing old songs his own father had taught him while Hope slept peacefully in his arms. The baby responded to their care with the kind of robust growth and happy disposition that seemed to confirm she belonged exactly where she had landed. The mystery of Hope's origins remained unsolved, though not for lack of careful consideration on the Hendersons' part. They speculated about the young woman who had written that heartbreaking note, imagining scenarios that ranged from tragic to hopeful. Perhaps she had been traveling through and found herself in desperate circumstances, or perhaps she was a local woman whose situation had become untenable. Martha found herself scanning the faces of every woman she encountered in town, looking for some sign of recognition or loss that might provide a clue to Hope's history. But as time passed and no one came forward with claims or information, the Hendersons began to accept that they might never know the full story of how Hope came to be in their barn that October night. The first winter with Hope was both challenging and magical. The Kansas prairie showed no mercy to anyone, and the Hendersons found themselves burning through their wood supply faster than usual as they worked to keep the cabin warm enough for a baby. Martha worried constantly about Hope's health during the coldest days, checking on her throughout the night and keeping her close to the fire during the day. Thomas made multiple trips through driving snow to ensure they had adequate supplies, and on more than one occasion he arrived home to find Martha singing softly to Hope while both of them were bundled together under every quilt they owned. But there were moments of pure joy that made every hardship worthwhile. Hope's first smile appeared during a fierce blizzard in January, and Martha swore later that the baby's happiness actually made the cabin feel warmer. The first time Hope laughed, Thomas was whittling by the fire while Martha cooked dinner, and the sound was so unexpected and delightful that both adults stopped what they were doing and spent the next hour trying unsuccessfully to coax another laugh from their daughter. For that was how they had begun to think of Hope, not as a foundling or a temporary responsibility, but as their daughter in every way that truly mattered. Spring brought new challenges and new joys as Hope began to show more personality and interest in the world around her. Martha would carry her outside to see the animals and the growing crops, and Hope seemed fascinated by everything she encountered. The chickens became a particular source of entertainment, and Martha would often find herself standing in the yard for longer than necessary because Hope was so obviously delighted by their antics. Thomas taught Hope to recognize the different sounds the animals made, and by summer she was attempting to mimic the mooing of the cows, with results that sent both her parents into fits of laughter. The first anniversary of Hope's arrival was marked by a celebration that felt more significant than any birthday either Martha or Thomas had ever experienced. They had invited their closest neighbors, the Morrison family, to share dinner with them, and Mrs. Morrison brought along a small cake she had baked specially for the occasion. As they sat around the table watching Hope attempt to eat cake with her hands while getting more of it on her face than in her mouth, Martha felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the mysterious circumstances that had brought this precious child into their lives. That night, after Hope had been fed and rocked to sleep, Martha and Thomas sat on their front porch, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed their daughter's arrival exactly 1 year earlier. They talked about the changes Hope had brought to their lives, changes that went far beyond the obvious joy of finally having a child to love and raise. Martha realized that she had stopped thinking of herself as barren or broken, and Thomas admitted that he had found a purpose in fatherhood that made all his other work feel more meaningful. They had become a family in the truest sense of the word, bound together not by blood, but by love and shared commitment to giving Hope the best life they possibly could. As Hope grew from baby to toddler, Her personality began to emerge in ways that delighted and occasionally challenged her parents. She was curious about everything, fearless in her exploration of their small world, and possessed of a stubborn streak that Martha suspected came from the same strong will that had enabled her birth mother to make the difficult decision to ensure her daughter's survival. Hope learned to walk by pulling herself up on everything from chair legs to the patient legs of old Samuel the horse, and her first word was "Mama," spoken clearly one morning when Martha was preparing breakfast and Hope was sitting in the high chair Thomas had built for her. The people of Willow Creek had gradually accepted the Henderson family's unusual origin story, and Hope became something of a local celebrity as she grew older. The other children in town seemed drawn to her natural confidence and infectious laugh, and Martha often found herself hosting impromptu gatherings of youngsters who had followed Hope home from church or from trips to the general store. These moments filled Martha with a happiness so complete it sometimes frightened her, as if such joy could not possibly be permanent or real. Thomas had prospered during Hope's early years, partly due to good weather and crop prices, but mostly because he attacked his work with the energy of a man who had something precious to protect and provide for. He expanded their cultivated acreage, improved their livestock holdings, and even managed to add a proper bedroom to their cabin so that Hope could have her own space as she grew older. The barn, where Hope had been found, was reinforced and expanded as well, and Thomas made sure to preserve the corner where they had discovered her, creating a small shrine of sorts with a wooden cross and flowers that Martha replaced regularly. By the time Hope reached her 4th birthday, she had grown into a bright, healthy, beautiful child who showed every sign of thriving in the loving environment the Hendersons had created for her. She could ride Samuel the horse with Thomas's help, could gather eggs from the chickens without fear, and had even learned to help Martha with simple cooking tasks. Her vocabulary had expanded to include complicated questions about everything she encountered, and Martha often found herself struggling to explain the complexities of adult life to someone whose innocence and trust made every answer feel inadequate. It was during Hope's 4th year that Martha began to tell her the story of how she had come to live with them, carefully crafting a version that emphasized love and special purposes rather than abandonment and desperation. Hope listened to these stories with the same fascination she brought to fairy tales, and seemed to understand that her arrival had been something magical rather than tragic. Martha always ended these conversations by telling Hope that she was the answer to prayers that Martha had not even known how to pray, and that sometimes the most wonderful things in life came in ways that no one could have predicted or planned. The question of Hope's legal status had been resolved through the Frontier's practical approach to such matters, with Sheriff Coleman eventually filing papers that established the Hendersons as Hope's legal guardians and ultimately her adoptive parents. Dr. Brennan had provided the necessary medical documentation, and the local preacher had offered to perform a formal blessing ceremony if the family desired one. Martha had kept the original note that had been left with Hope, storing it carefully in her Bible with the intention of sharing it with Hope when she was old enough to understand its significance. As the years passed and Hope grew from a toddler into a young child, Martha sometimes wondered about the woman who had written that note and made the impossible choice to leave her daughter in a stranger's barn. She hoped that somehow, somewhere, Hope's birth mother knew that her daughter was loved and safe and thriving. Martha had often imagined writing a letter of gratitude to this unknown woman, though she had no way of delivering such a message. Instead, she made sure that Hope knew she was cherished, not just by the family that was raising her, but by the brave woman who had loved her enough to ensure her survival even at the cost of her own heartbreak. The Henderson family had become a fixture in Willow Creek, known for their generosity, their strong marriage, and their delightful daughter who seemed to embody the best qualities of the frontier spirit. Hope was fearless but not reckless, kind but not naive, and possessed of a natural leadership ability that drew other children to follow her adventures. Martha and Thomas often marveled at the child they were raising, recognizing qualities in her that seemed to come from sources beyond their own influence or example. Hope's 5th birthday celebration was the largest social gathering the Henderson homestead had ever hosted, with families coming from miles around to help commemorate the occasion. Mrs. Morrison had organized the other women to bring enough food for a small army, and the men had set up tables and benches in the yard so everyone could eat together. Hope, dressed in a new blue dress that Martha had sewn specially for the occasion, moved through the crowd like a young queen holding court, graciously accepting gifts and attention with a poise that seemed far beyond her years. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and Hope had been tucked into bed with her new doll and picture book, Martha and Thomas sat in their usual spot on the front porch and reflected on the incredible journey their family had traveled. 5 years had passed since that October night when Martha had heard crying in the barn, and those years had been filled with more joy and purpose than either of them had dared to hope for during their earlier struggles with childlessness. Hope had not just filled the empty spaces in their lives, she had expanded their capacity for love and happiness in ways they were still discovering. Thomas reached over and took Martha's hand, a gesture that had become their evening ritual during Hope's childhood years. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night and feeling the deep contentment that comes from knowing you have found your true purpose in life. Martha thought about the dreams she had abandoned during those years of disappointed hopes and realized that the reality of raising Hope had surpassed any fantasy she had ever entertained about motherhood. The child sleeping peacefully in the next room was not just their daughter. She was living proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams come true in the most unexpected ways. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Martha whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided Hope to their barn that night 5 years ago. She thanked the unknown woman who had made the ultimate sacrifice of maternal love. She thanked Thomas for embracing Hope with the same devotion he might have shown a biological child. And she thanked God for the privilege of raising this remarkable little girl. The infertile farmer, who had once believed her dreams of motherhood were dead and buried, had discovered that some dreams simply take longer to grow than others, and that the waiting only makes their eventual flowering more precious and miraculous. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more stories of frontier life, courage, and the unexpected ways families are formed on the American prairie. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, so please share your thoughts about Martha, Thomas, and Little Hope's story, and let us know what other Old West tales you'd like to hear. Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that changed your life completely? Tell us about it in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories from the frontier.